Hey everyone, how's it going? Azren the Language Nerd here. Hope you're doing very well. Welcome to another episode of Ask the Language Nerd. This is the show where I take a lot of your guys' questions from a variety of different social media networks and I answer them in video form. If you ever want to submit something for Ask the Language Nerd, you're welcome to do so. I will put all of my social media networks on the screen right now, and those are the places you can hit me up. A couple of things before we jump into today. First of all, obviously there's a very different setting, very different background today because currently I am in India. And so you'll probably notice like the overall picture quality today is going to be, actually today and even for the next, call it month or so, is going to be quite a bit lower than normal because I don't have my normal video equipment with me. I'm literally using my digital camera, and as for lighting, I've got like a headlamp that is like attached to a treadmill in front of me right now. Number two, if you asked for a postcard, I mailed them out today, so you should receive them, call it within a week or two of this video going live. Yeah, with those two aside, let's jump into the show. First question here is, Azren, I tend to get really discouraged when I'm learning languages, and I do a lot of negative self-talk. I say things like, oh, I'll never learn the language, or no matter how hard I try, I'll never be able to learn English. What do you do about it? How do you get out of that mental state? I think a really big thing to think about is your environment. In other words, if you have a very positive environment around whatever language you're learning, it's a lot easier to be positive. And so what happens is that, if you're beating yourself up negatively about whatever language, English I think it was in this case, I would look at, surrounding yourself with some positive-minded people who are also learning English or who are also learning a language. You can find lots of great communities online, even like italki.com, you can find great communities. You can find great online language exchange partners on things like HelloTalk. You can go on YouTube and make a lot of online friends. You can make in-person friends as well by using websites like meetup.com. Like there's a lot of different resources and options. And so the moral of the story here is to use a lot of these resources to create that positive environment around you to fight some of that negative self-talk. Next question we have here is, Azren, what suggestions do you have for beginners on starting conversations during language exchanges? Fantastic question. First of all, language exchanges, for those of you who don't know, it's basically where you help someone learn your first language and they help you learn their first language. So it's a really good strategy that a lot of people use. And I think a fantastic thing to think about if you are a beginner is to prepare heavily in advance and make sure that you are only talking about like very specific topics. For example, if you're learning Spanish and you're doing a Spanish exchange, maybe you tell your exchange partner in advance that, hey, I want to make sure we only talk about foods today. Like one thing for me is to talk about foods because I'm trying to learn those. I want to be able to ask you, do you have any allergies? And you will answer. Then you'll ask me, what's your favorite food? And I will answer. So really structure that out in whatever way you want to make sure that you're able to actually make productive use of the time and get some speaking in. One common mistake that people make is they jump into this language exchange and they try to just piece together sentences and have these spontaneous conversations, but they're nowhere near a high enough level to do that. And so the end result becomes that they're just frustrated, they're disappointed, they feel like they don't know anything, they feel really dumb sometimes. And so, just jumping into it and trying to have that spontaneous conversation is a very common mistake. And it's often why people struggle with being consistent with online language exchanges. So a couple things to think about. Hope that's helpful. The next one we have here has been requested by a variety of people on Instagram, which is, Azren, share 5 random facts about you. Sure, why not? First of all, I have like a weird fear of shower curtains. Like I'm weird about them. I feel like they're gonna attack me or something, which is odd, but I don't know, it's one of those things. Number 2, when I was a kid, I used to think there were sharks in swimming pools. I used to actually see them. Number 3, I electrocuted myself the other day while trying to kill a mosquito. Go to my Instagram to see that story. Number 4, I played soccer competitively for about 13 years. It was a pretty major part of my life. And number 5, I actually did martial arts for, it would have been about 12 or 13 years as well. The next question we have is, Azren, I'd love to hear your thoughts on laddering to learn a language. For example, if I learn Spanish as a second language, maybe I try to learn a third language using a Spanish medium. Yeah, I think overall, I'm going to give two different answers for this. My first answer is I think it's a generally good idea if you have a high enough level in that first language. For example, I was having a conversation with one of my students, a few months ago, I think, where he had a decent level in French and he wanted to learn Spanish. And so we were talking about it and we thought that maybe it'd be a good idea for him to learn Spanish with me, but I teach him Spanish speaking to him in French. So we're speaking French, but learning Spanish. And this can be a great way to improve your second language, like your upper intermediate language, while learning a completely new language. It can be I guess a bit of a 2-in-1 strategy. One thing to be mindful of is you want to make sure that whatever the second language is, like if you're learning French through Spanish, you want to make sure your Spanish level is high enough. It's at a relatively high level. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to learn French. You're not going to be able to learn that third language or that second foreign language, if that makes sense. The other thing to think about as well, and this is just a global general thing that I think many of you will find helpful, is that, you know, anytime you're thinking like, oh, I think this might be a good idea, I think laddering might be a good idea, I think this might be a good idea, I think that might work. You know, I think a lot of people just debate it and they think about it quite a bit. You know, I'm someone who just goes, try it. Like if you think it's going to be good, don't sit there worrying and thinking, oh, what am I going to do? Should I try it? Should I not? Just try it and see what happens. I think that's often the best way to really figure out if something works for you or not. And it's a lot faster at times than to sit there and thinking about it or researching it or like watching videos for hours and hours and hours. You can often just get all that work done in like, you know, 1 hour just by testing it out or whatever it is, right? Next question we have is, Azren, I am currently learning Spanish and I was wondering how I should memorize the new words. My memory is not very good. Good question. I think one major mistake people make when they're trying to memorize new words is they go like all in on one strategy. For example, maybe they only write the word like over and over and over and over. They just keep writing it and writing it and writing it. Or maybe they just keep doing flashcards over and over and over and over and over. But the problem is that's only utilizing like one different learning strategy. So if you're writing it over and over and over and over and over, maybe you're good at using that word in a written context, but the next time you hear that word, your brain doesn't fully recognize it and you're like, oh, what was that? Oh, I forget. And you can't fully access it. Or maybe when you have to use it in a spoken context, you struggle because you haven't spoken it much. So I think trying to find different ways to practice the words is a good idea. A couple of different options would be picking out some of the new words and writing a story. That's a good way, especially because stories help new things actually sink into your mind because your brain can remember stories decently easily, like relatively easily. I think another similar strategy is if you can take your phone and record yourself talking out some kind of a story using some of the new words. I think you can set goals for yourself as well. Things like, I'm going to use X, Y, Z new words 3 times today. That's a good way. I sometimes write new words on my hand because I keep seeing it consistently throughout the day until it washes off, so that like helps it stick in my memory. So these are a couple different strategies. Flashcards really work. I mean, these are a couple different strategies to help really lock those words in. And I'd recommend you use at least a few of them to make sure you're able to remember things in the fastest possible way. The next question we have is, Azren, if somebody makes a mistake, should that mistake be immediately corrected? Or should you only correct mistakes if they're like major mistakes? Good question, and this is something that people often debate about. Here's a couple of things I think you should think about. First of all, it depends on the purpose of the conversation. If you're talking to your teacher, okay, and you're asking your teacher for help, and the purpose of the conversation is to improve your language abilities, yeah, your teacher probably should be a little bit more picky to make sure you're saying things properly. On the other hand, if you're hanging out with friends at a bar, you know, the purpose of the conversation is not necessarily to really improve your language skills. The purpose is to hang out, have some fun. So maybe they're going to be less picky and they'll only correct like the major errors where they didn't even understand what you were saying. I'd also think about what the language learner actually wants to achieve overall. For example, if the language learner wants to become like super duper perfect in that language and they want to be so good that they basically come across as a native, you know, you probably do need to be more picky, because if you want to sound quote unquote like a native speaker, well, you're gonna have to make sure your accent is on point, you're not making grammar mistakes, like everything has to be like near perfect, if not perfect. On the other hand, I feel like most people really are not trying to achieve that kind of level. I think the majority of language learners just want to achieve a certain level of proficiency. And if that's the case, you know, I don't think it is as important to correct every single mistake, because to become proficient or decent or like quite good at a language, you don't need to be perfect at everything. You don't need to understand every aspect. You just need to be pretty good or quite good enough to be able to communicate and understand almost everything, most things, and etc. And last but not least, what I'll say on this topic is you can't like correct everything. It just doesn't work. Your brain can't remember everything. Like if we have a 20-minute conversation and I give you 50 corrections, you're just not going to be able to take that much. Your brain cannot contain all that information inside itself, and you're just going to get overwhelmed. And ultimately that 50 pieces of feedback or comments or corrections or whatever that I gave you in a 20-minute period, it's probably not going to do you any good, because you'll just be so overwhelmed that nothing actually gets absorbed into your brain. At a certain point, you can't correct everything, and you're going to have to let some things go in order for the conversation to move forward and in order for the learner to really actually absorb anything and make consistent progress. When you're learning a language on your own, how do you find resources for lesser known languages? Good question. You know, when you're learning quote unquote lesser known language where there's less resources available, you need to understand that's just a reality. It's going to be harder to find resources because there just are less resources available. That being said, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to just be more creative. I'll give you an example. You know, a few weeks ago, I was really struggling with trying to figure out, how do I know if something is like masculine, feminine, or neutral in Gujarati? And I was like trying to figure out what the pattern was. And when I asked people directly, they couldn't explain it to me. No one really seemed to know. I couldn't find it online. I was like, crap. So I decided to go and look at Hindi, because Hindi and Gujarati are quite similar, and there's way more resources online for Hindi. So I looked into Hindi genders, thinking that maybe the same rule is going to cross over into Gujarati because they are similar enough languages. So that's like, it's just trying to get creative, right? So overall, I think a practical thing you can do is try to mix resources. So maybe there's not one really good YouTube channel that just has everything for you, but maybe you find someone who teaches grammar well. Maybe you find like one textbook that is amazing for, you know, I don't know, vocabulary. Maybe you happen to find this one app that has basic phrases. So mix and match your resources and put them together to create the ultimate resource that like you need for your language needs. Well everyone, we're gonna wrap the video up there for a couple of reasons. Number one, the camera is getting very hot and I'm getting a little worried. Number two, I'm starting to cook in this room because the fan is off and it's like 30, God knows what degrees outside. It's like 36 degrees outside. It's like 90 in the 90s Fahrenheit for the American viewers, so it's like kind of cooking here, so I just gotta stop. Thank you for watching. Really, really appreciate your attention. And yeah, we'll talk later. Bye for now.